So I wonder, with the Mamdani story, and I wonder if this is useful, that it's really a matter of emphasis. The emphasis in my culture, America, Britain, Europe, Western culture, is of course on the individual. So we imagine that Zoran Mamdani, Bernie Sanders, Jeremy Corbyn to some extent, to any of these, to Trump, we imagine that this personality has triggered something in his followers. Viktor Orban. It really doesn't matter which one you choose. I would not choose Jeremy. I would not choose Keir Starmer, because God knows why anybody would have elected him to anything. He is the conundrum, not the one everybody, Johnson, not him, Boris Johnson. One could understand. One could disagree. It's an interesting thing to me about this Charlie Kirk thing. I read about him, I think, a couple of months ago. I'd never heard of him before. And there was some particular thing that he said that caused a stir. And so I looked him up, and I saw this sort of rather wan, a bit like Tucker Carlson, not a very frightening fellow. I saw this rather kind of modified, moderate chap saying things that I totally disagreed with, but not saying them in any sort of an objectionable way. Poor Charlie's 31, and it's interesting to me because I'm reading about his murder today, and I'm hearing a lot about what an awful man he was, and there was no evidence of his awfulness to me. You know, if you present me with Donald Trump, Joseph Stalin, whatever, really awful people, I go, yeah, they're awful people. We've met them in the past. I've met lots of them. I work in the theatre, trust me. You meet a lot of real narcissists in the theatre, and I don't mean actors. But anyway, so there's that take on what's going on, that these men come from out of nowhere. They're not predictable, men and women. Margaret Thatcher, for instance, they're not predictable. They show up, and they seem to have a sort of cast a spell over their constituencies, who then find themselves, having epiphanies and awakening and all kinds of things. All of which I think, if you don't take responsibility for your own thoughts and your own beliefs, that will happen to you. Somebody will suddenly show up and you'll go, hey, I rather like those ideas he's saying. But Trump, being as objectionable as he has made racism kind of okay. It doesn't mean that it wasn't there before. He's just made it okay to express it. Racism is an ancient thing. It's not as ancient as the right wingers would wish for you to believe, but it is quite deep and part definitely of Western civilization, Western Christian civilization. Which racism is a step beyond prejudice or mistrust or any of those kinds of things. I believe in the ancient world, there are lots of wars between Greeks and Persians. There might have been some prig, Demosthenes, sitting in Athens, or Aristotle, if you like, sitting behind, which is interesting, who made up theories of racial inequality or some other form of inequality. Cultural inequality, let's say. Alexander goes out there and encounters these people, and he goes, well, they're not unequal. They don't fight as well as we do, but they bleed the same blood. And so, his movement through that part of the world was of a very different order. And he slept, it is said, with the Cyropedia being the book about, I believe, written by Xenophon. I could be wrong on that, but the Cyropedia Xenophon, he of the root word of xenophobia, who was considered his hero to be Cyrus the Great, who was Persian. So add that up with xenophobia, and apparently that was what Alexander did. So whatever the biases might have been, they are, by getting out into the world and encountering these other people, our minds are changed. And I'm sure Aristotle sat at home grumbling about this, like Demosthenes did, sat at home and went, "Oh, this is just terrible," rather like the Americans during the Indian Wars. This is a strange phenomenon of many of the not all of them, certainly not Custer, but many of the Indian fighters, the famous ones, because they were encountering the Indians, developed quite a respect for them. General Crook, that I've talked about before, the rather famous one, a devout Christian as well, who encountered, Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull and Red Cloud and stuff, and said, "Well, I have to tell you, they have a point." T.E. Lawrence, way back then. Anyway, to get back to Mamdani and stuff like this, I think it is because the society is moving. The masses are moving. They're not being led. And the notion of how fatuous and silly the concept of leadership is, especially from people who are believers in prophets, for instance. The coolest guy on the block must have been, and I've done this myself. I mean, imagine meeting Jesus. You would have gone like, "Gee, wow, you would have gone, Jesus, what a dude." I imagine that. I'm not sure that that's true. But what I do think, or my theory, is that in fact, the culture, the society, not culture so much, because culture somehow retards progress. We say, "Oh, let's go out and drink tonight." That's culture. It retards progress. I love culture. We sit in culture. It gives us a lot of replenishment, but it's not the same thing as society. In society, the media and the actual reality of our presidencies and the realities of the economy and things like that. So somebody comes along and says in New York City, things should be fairer. And in fact, the entire of American society is based on the notion of things are not fair. There's nothing that you can do about that. Some people are just better than others and they will be the big earners and stuff. That's what people believe, and maybe it's true. I don't believe it because it means nothing to me. So the notion that after 2 years, or virtually 2 years of what's been going on in Israel and Palestine, which is an eye-opener, if you have eyes, an eye-opener to particularly the Western world, it doesn't really matter who's at fault. Doesn't really matter who's at fault. It's just the fact of what's going on. Proves that people who make great claims about superiority and supremacy are clearly wrong. It really doesn't matter how you shake that and bake that. What is being done in Gaza is barbarous. You might say it's justified barbarism. It doesn't change the fact it's barbarous. And I think people wake up to that, and so that the people who are voting for Mamdani are not just saying, I want things to be fair, I want to be able to afford life in New York and things like that. The point being that New York has been run to date, and many societies, they have been run to date for and by, have been run for the successful or the wealthy. I don't even see the wealthy as being successful. They have been run for a certain community, and that's been accepted. And I think finally it's no longer accepted.